Hi everyone, thank you for joining us in today's webinar, Leadership's Perception Gap, Research on Diversity, Inclusion, and Managers. My name is Jennifer Ng, and I'm the Associate Marketing Manager at the Myers-Briggs Company. This webinar will be recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording and the slides later this week. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the questions box. And now I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, John Hackston. John is the head of thought leadership and has been with the Myers-Briggs Company for almost 25 years. John lives and breathes psychometrics and is one of the leading authorities in the application of personality type. John's role is pivotal in keeping the MBTI framework relevant to our ever-changing work environments. He does this through research like he will be presenting today. So I will hand it over to you, John.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jen. And yeah, thanks for that lovely introduction. And also thanks for that, frankly, rather flattering picture, for a flattering photo of me. So yes, everybody, welcome to this session on Leadership's Perception Gap. Today we'll be focusing on inclusion and inclusive leadership in particular. But before I get into the details of this, I'm going to ask you a question. And it's not a question that you need to give me an answer to. But by all means, put some comments about it in the question box if you'd like to. So here's a question coming now. How committed is your organization to diversity, to equity, and to inclusion? What actions, perhaps, has it taken to improve these? As I said, this isn't an informal poll or anything, but I think it's certainly a question worth asking. Because whatever you think happens in your organization, there's certainly a lot of attention given to diversity, to equity, to inclusion. And one result of that we've seen is an increase in diversity-related jobs. Here are some statistics on the slide on your screen now. You can see from a survey a couple of years ago. So 90% of Fortune 500 companies have onboarded an executive whose focus is on diversity. And in the last 5 years, there's been over 100% increase in executives with job titles relating to diversity and inclusion. These are from an American survey, and to some extent the United States is leading the way here, but global research from LinkedIn suggests much the same thing. And of course, there are very good reasons for this. There's still very much a hill to climb when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, for example, women and people from a minority background aren't as represented as they should be in the top-level jobs. The data on the slide you can see at the moment is based on 38,000 mainly US-based executives and 135,000 senior managers who took the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator assessment between 2012 and 2021. Now, back in 2012, the proportion of women at an executive level, that's the orange line, was only 35% of where it should be. By last year, it had risen to 40%. So things are getting better, but very slowly. And these are the sorts of troubling findings that motivate organizations to create diversity programs. But of course, these don't always work. There was an article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago by Frank Dobbin and Alexander Kalev that looked at the effectiveness of different forms of diversity initiatives. What they found was that most of the time, mandatory diversity training turned into a box-ticking exercise. It didn't actually increase diversity, and indeed for some groups, it actually made things worse. The proportion of black women in management, for example, actually decreased by 9% on average in those organizations, while the numbers of Asian men shrank by 4% and Asian women by 5%. Many participants saw the training as unnecessary, they resisted attending, and perhaps because of this, some actually reported more animosity to other groups, to people different from themselves, after the training than they did before. Sometimes diversity programs take too simplistic an approach or ignore the bigger picture. So, for example, attempting to recruit individuals from a minority background without paying attention to how included or excluded those people feel once they actually get in the organization, once they become an employee. Do those people then really feel appreciated and encouraged to participate fully in the organization? Or do they just up sticks and leave after a short while? Now, for some of these programs, the missing ingredient may be inclusion. Without inclusion, diversity programs may fail. So here's one example. I live in the United Kingdom, that's where I'm presenting from now. And last year, there was a lot in the news about the underrepresentation of minority groups in science in the United Kingdom. For example, 12% of white scientists in British universities have reached the level of professor, but only 3.5% are black scientists. Black scientists are less likely to get an academic job in the first place, and when they do, they're less likely to be promoted, and they're more likely to leave. So even if diversity initiatives were effective in getting people to be students from different groups, when it comes to inclusion, the process is failing. And although this data has only recently been compiled, it's sadly not a surprise. There was an article in the journal Science 5 years ago, entitled "Without Inclusion, Diversity Initiatives May Not Be Enough," warning about this very issue in STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, and math. To quote the article, "Simply admitting an underrepresented minority student is not enough. If that student feels unwelcome, feels unheard, feels undervalued." And sadly, in a number of organizations, you could probably substitute the word employee for student in that quote. So without inclusion, diversity initiatives may not be enough. So we're going to concentrate then on inclusion today. So what is inclusion exactly, and how does it work? It's often thought of as something that somehow needs to be done to groups that have been historically excluded from society, from organizations, from management. But actually, anyone can feel included or not included at work. We carried out some research last year into inclusion at work. And these are some of the things that people said when we asked them what inclusion was. I'm respected for who I am. I can be my authentic self. I feel included by my co-workers and by my manager. I feel able to participate and contribute. I'm included in decision making. And my views are respected, accepted, and acted on. Now, one of the things that I think comes through from these comments, and indeed from our research more generally, is that inclusion is about relationships with other people. Diversity can be, at least to some extent, mandated from the top. Inclusion is much more about the voluntary actions of individuals. Now, I've been talking about our research. The answers you can see on the screen even, I beg your pardon, came from a survey that we carried out last year where 251 participants answered a whole load of questions about how included they felt at work. And we're going to look at some of the results of that research now. Now, in terms of who took part, most consider themselves to be either female or male, although other groups were represented, and a majority consider themselves to be heterosexual or straight. Several different races or ethnicities were represented. Terminologies vary from country to country. Here's a breakdown for the US sample. Over half the group worked in the United States, over a quarter in the United Kingdom, and 15% from elsewhere in the world. So that's who took part in the survey. But let's look at what sort of questions we actually asked people. Here's two examples. And actually, we're going to launch a poll now to see how you would answer these two questions. So let's look at that first question. My manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including mine. let's launch our poll now. You should be able to answer that on a scale from strongly agree to down to strongly disagree. Let's just give you a little while to answer that question. Okay, let's see how we're doing. We've got moving towards half of you voting. Let's have a few more votes if we can. Okay, the numbers are creeping up. Okay, let's see if we can get to 2/3 of you voting. 63%, 64%, we're nearly there. Okay, there's 2/3. Let's close the poll now and share the results. So what you can see there is that 39% of you strongly agree with that statement. 39% agree. So by my reckoning, that's 78% either agree or strongly agree that your manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including mine. In a moment, we'll see how that compares with what people in our survey said. It's notable that some of you do disagree and 2% strongly disagree. We may come back to that in a little while as well. Let's hide that and let's go on to another poll, which is our second question. In my workplace, I'm encouraged to be my authentic self. Let's launch that one now and see what you say to that. Okay, numbers are coming in. Again, let's see if we have at least 2/3 of you voting. Okay, over half of you. Let the numbers get a little bit more. Okay, that's 64%. And there's 2/3 of you, so we close the poll now. And there we go. Let me share the results. So slightly less emphatic this time. Again, majority agree or strongly agree. So 28% strongly agree, 39% agree. So unless I've got my numbers wrong, that's 67% either agree or strongly agree. I'm sure one of you will put me right if I've got my calculations wrong. My background, I'm a statistician, not a mathematician, so I don't always get the exact numbers right. Again, a number of you do disagree or even strongly disagree with that statement. Okay, let's see how people who took part in our survey answered those questions and other questions. Because what I'm going to show you now are the 3 most agreed with questions and the 3 least agreed with questions across the survey. So for example, on the question you can see on the screen at the moment, I'm accepted by my co-workers, only 2% strongly disagreed with that, 4% disagreed, 12% were in the neither category, 48% agreed, 34% strongly agreed, meaning that overall 82% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Here's the rest of the top 3 most agreed with items and also the bottom 3, the least agreed with items. And one of the questions we asked you was that second question there, my manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including mine. And you were actually, as a group, quite close to what this group thought. You thought 75% of you thought that, 78% of you thought that your manager seeked out your perceptions, compared with 75% in our survey, so you're a little bit more positive there. The other question we asked you was about, in my workplace, I'm encouraged to be my authentic self. You're actually a bit more positive than our sample here. 67% of you agreed or strongly agreed, whereas only 52% of our sample. But if you look generally at those numbers, you can see that generally they are on the positive side. All except the very last one, more than 50% of the group agreed or strongly agreed that they felt included in one way or another. So generally, on the whole, people felt included, with some exceptions which we'll come to in a moment. And all of these questions were about how included people felt, what we've called perceived organizational inclusion. By background, we're psychologists, we like to give exact name to things. And we'd written the questions in our survey to measure 4 dimensions, 4 scales of this perceived organizational inclusion. We looked at how included by their co-workers people felt themselves to be, how included by their manager they felt, the extent to which they felt valued by their organization and at home there, and the extent to which they felt able to be their authentic selves, who they really were. And this slide should give you an idea of the sort of questions we asked for each dimension. This isn't all the questions in the survey. These are just some examples of the sort of questions we put into each scale. Now, when we looked at the scores on each of these scales, we found, perhaps not surprisingly, that some people, some groups, felt more included than others. So, for example, one of the things we found was that those who preferred not to disclose their sexuality felt less included on all 4 scales. So the bars on this chart represent the average score on the inclusion scale for people who said they were bisexual, who said they were gay or lesbian, who said they were heterosexual or straight, and who actually said they prefer not to disclose their sexuality. Now, what I should say about these results is that this survey was entirely anonymous and entirely confidential, and that was made really clear to people who took part in the survey. It wasn't done within just one organization. It was an open access survey, but anyone could fill in, and it was really clear that we could not trace in any way people back as individuals to their responses. Despite that anonymity, some people felt they preferred not to disclose their sexuality in the survey, and those people felt significantly less included by their organizations, which suggests that in real life, in an organization, if you feel you can't disclose your sexuality, you may feel less included in all 4 of these aspects. You may also notice that the other 3 groups are generally quite similar, although the group of people who said they were heterosexual or straight tend to be either the most included or second most included on each of these scales. And there was one item in particular which actually seemed to show a difference. One question in particular which seemed to show a difference between these groups. I really feel excluded by my co-workers. 2/3, 68% of those who said they were heterosexual or straight agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, but only 50% of those who said they were bisexual, only 1/4 of those who said they were gay or lesbian, and only 11% of those who preferred not to disclose their sexuality. So sexuality may, it seems, and perhaps not surprisingly, have an effect on how excluded you may sometimes feel by some of your co-workers. In terms of people from different backgrounds, we found that people who were Latino, Latina, or Hispanic in origin, and who said to express themselves as being that, they came out as the least included. They felt the least valued by and at home in their organization, and the least able to be their authentic selves. White or Caucasian American groups felt the most included, with American Asian and African American or Black in the middle. And these were statistically significant findings. And some individual questions showed especially large differences. So, for example, 2/3 of the white group said they agreed or strongly agreed that they felt at home in their organization, but only 20% of the Hispanic group. So on average, people in some groups felt more included in their organizations than people in other groups, which may be a worrying finding. We found that more senior people felt more included, so people at the C-suite, executive and senior management levels scored significantly high on that scale of feeling valued and at home in the organization, and middle management, first line management or regular employees. We found that diversity programs did have a positive impact. Where there was a diversity program in place, people felt more included by their manager. But programs that specifically concentrated on inclusion had a much greater impact, both in terms of a bigger difference between organizations where those programs were or were not present, and also in terms of affecting more aspects of inclusion. And all of these programs were seen as more effective if they contained a training element. Anything that was mainly a purely target-driven was seen as less effective, or even as box checking, even more so for inclusion programs than for diversity programs, which really, I think, fits with that research which was outlined in the Harvard Business Review that I mentioned a little while ago. And where the attention paid to either diversity or inclusion had decreased, people felt less included on all four scales. Let me just talk through what's on this chart, because there's lots of bars and lots of numbers there. So if we take the graph to the left-hand side, attention paid to diversity last year, and we call it the section labeled valuable at home, the green bar represents people who said more attention was being paid to diversity and inclusion than the previous year. The orange or amber bar, people who said things are much the same. And the red bar, people who said less attention has been paid to diversity. And what you can see there is that where more attention had been paid to diversity, people felt a little bit more valued by an at-home organization, but if things have stayed the same. Whereas the red bar shows that where people felt less attention to be paid to diversity, those people said rather more undervalued, rather less valued by an at-home organization. And if you look across all of those different bars, you see that in general, and for all of these scales, for both diversity and inclusion programs, if people felt less attention was being paid by last year, they felt much less included. And what this means, I think, is that if you have a big initiative, a big push on inclusion or diversity in one year, you do need to keep things going. Or things may end up being a little bit worse, actually, than where you started. Now, an individual's personality influenced one area of inclusion. We'll talk about that in a moment, but just to say, within this research, we use the MBTI framework, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator framework, and we're going to briefly mention some things about that. But just so I know where you are, before I start going through these results in detail, let's just see how familiar you all are with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator approach. So I've just launching a poll, and you have a number of options. You may be an MBTI practitioner and use it often. You may have received MBTI feedback but not qualified. You may have heard of the MBTI but not had feedback. You may be saying, hey, what's the MBTI? So let me just give you a moment to answer that poll. And over half of you have answered that. Let's see if we can get up to 2/3 again. So give you a little while longer just to vote. Okay. We're moving up to 3/4. Just give it a few more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll now. And I share the results. So what we found is that 39% of you are MBTI practitioners, 42% have received MBTI feedback, 13% of you have heard of the MBTI but not have had feedback, and 5% have said, what's the MBTI? So I'm going to beg the indulgence, if I may, of those of you who know lots about the MBTI practitioners, just for a short while, just to say a little bit about what the MBTI is all about for those people on the call, on the webinar, who aren't that familiar with the MBTI. So, as you can see on the screen at the moment, the MBTI really looks at 4 aspects of personality. It looks, first of all, at extroversion or introversion. This is all about where you get your energy from and where you focus your attention. Are you somebody who tends to focus their attention on and get their energy from the outside world, the people and things, or your inner world of thoughts and feelings? Extroversion from the outside world, introversion from the inside world. And actually we'll all do both. We'll do some things in the outside world, some things inside our heads, but the idea is that you have a preference for one side or the other, extroversion or introversion. Sensing or intuition. What sort of information do you prefer to use and do you trust? Do you prefer information which is solid, which is real, which is actual, which is based on the evidence of your 5 senses, hence sensing? Or do you prefer information which is about how things connect together? Possibilities of what could be, what the big picture is, in which case we'd say you had preferences for intuition. And again, you use both sensing and intuition, but you have a preference for one side or the other. Thinking and feeling. Do you prefer to make decisions on the basis of objective logic, in which case we'd say you have preferences for thinking? Or do you prefer to make decisions on the basis of your values and how those decisions will affect people? Making a decision which is right for people, a decision which is right, rather than necessarily the logically correct decision, in which case we'd say you have preferences for feeling. And finally, judging and perceiving, how you deal with the world around you. Do you prefer to live your life in a structured, ordered, planned way, in which case we'd say you had preferences for judging? Or do you prefer to live your life in a more open-ended, unstructured, unplanned way, in which case we'd say you had preferences for perceiving? So the idea is that we have preferences for extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, judging or perceiving. And the combination of those preferences goes together dynamically to say something about who you are as a whole person. So, for example, if you had preferences for introversion, sensing, thinking, and judging, we'd say you had preferences for ISTJ at the top left of the set of boxes there, the responsible realist. Now, I've talked about these as a set of boxes. They shouldn't confine you. They should really be more about your home base, and you can visit other types and do other things with your and flex your personality where you need to, but that's perhaps the real you. So that's the basis, I guess, of the MBTI. Let's see how it relates to inclusion. And personality type had a big effect on one specific aspect of inclusion, how included by your manager you felt yourself to be. People with preference for introverted thinking felt the most included by the manager. People with preference for introverted sensing, the least included by their manager. ISTP and INTP on the one hand, and ISFJ and INTJ on the other hand. Perhaps that isn't surprising that its relationship with your manager, which is so dependent on perhaps your personality and perhaps their personality as well. One of the other things we found was that managers who had an intuition preference seemed to feel they were more inclusive themselves than other managers. But we'll come on to that in a little while. So let's look at what we've talked about so far. We've seen that inclusion has several dimensions, 4 different dimensions or facets. We've seen that most people do feel included at work, but some people don't. Especially those who feel they can't disclose their sexuality to some extent, lesbian and gay staff. Minority groups, especially those from Latino, or Hispanic background, less senior employees, people in organizations where there are no diversity programs and more especially no inclusion programs in existence, and where less attention is being paid to diversity and or inclusion than was previously the case. And also that personality or your personality affects how included by your manager you feel yourself to be. But why should we be worried about this, perhaps? Why should we be concerned about inclusion? I guess it's nice that your employees feel included, but here's a question. Does it actually really matter if they don't? Well, yes. An increasing amount of research suggests that inclusion does matter, but it is important. So employees who feel more included perform better, they're more innovative, they create high-performing teams. Workplace inclusion increases innovation, job satisfaction and quality of care in that particular role. Hospital service staff on our second research study. 2 research studies showing that inclusion increases organizational citizenship behavior. Now, for those who haven't come across that term before, organizational citizenship, it means what it says. It does what it says on the can. It's about being a good citizen for your organization. It's about showing and carrying out behaviors which probably aren't explicitly part of your job, not in your job description. Behaviors that aren't perhaps explicitly rewarded, but that have the organization function, the glue to some extent that holds the organization together. They may be things that are directed at other people in the organization, like being kind, being courteous, being altruistic, or more wide behaviors that have the organization as a whole, being conscientious, doing the right thing, doing your duty. And this is what we mean by organizational citizenship. And inclusion and feeling inclusion seems to increase those behaviors and help the organization function more effectively. In that last study, where organizations valued inclusion, they had more inclusive HR practices, in fact, led to more inclusive HR practices, and that in turn increased the effectiveness of the organization. And we've carried out a separate piece of research which shows very much the same thing ourselves. So in a separate piece of research, a number of participants completed our scale of how included you felt to be by your manager, and also a measure of well-being at work. And what we're going to look at is the average level of well-being for people who have scored at different levels on a manager inclusion scale. So if we look at that graph, if we look at the left-hand column in the lightest green color, those are people who scored low on the inclusion by manager scale, who essentially felt they were much less included by their manager than most other people did. And if you read across the scale on the left, you can see that those people had a pretty low level of well-being in the workplace. As the level of inclusion by your manager increases, so does how well you feel at work, or level of well-being in the workplace, until we get to people who score really high, score 9 or 10 on the manager inclusion scale, and they felt they very much felt in a good place at work. And for those of you who like statistics, that's a nice big chunky linear correlation of just under 0.5. And the thing about this is that well-being isn't just a nice to have. People with higher levels of well-being are less likely to be looking for a new job, have greater engagement, they have higher levels of job satisfaction, they can feel more emotionally committed to their organization, and they show more of those positive organizational citizenship behaviors. In the same piece of research, we also gave people a questionnaire related to counterproductive behaviors. And this is really, I guess, the opposite of organizational citizenship. It's things like, do you badmouth your own organization to people from outside your organization? Things that tend to not contribute well to the running of the organization. You can probably guess how this graph comes out. It's this way around. The more inclusive your manager is, the less likely you are to indulge in those counterproductive behaviors. And again, a statistically significant correlation of just under 0.3. So inclusion is important. But if feeling included is important, how do we increase inclusion? Well, to find out, we asked our survey participants that very same question. We asked them the question you can see on the screen at the moment: what one action would make you feel more included? And before I do the big reveal of our own results, of our survey results, you might want to think about how you would answer that same question. What one action would make you feel more included at work? Now, this was an open-ended question, so our survey participants could say pretty much anything they wanted to here. But their answers, we found, fell into a number of overall themes. And these are the results. So the most common theme, the most frequently mentioned theme, was about having more contact with, and more communication from, and more transparency from their managers, and also from senior managers. So relationship with managers was really important. That was followed by action on specific issues, then being included or consulted more in decisions and planning and so on. Then a certain proportion of people said, actually, I'm fine. I already feel included, nothing more is needed. As we go down through that list, you'll see that second from the bottom there, some people said things like inclusion has gone too far, we should stop talking about inclusion, we should take care of the majority. Perhaps not surprisingly, men were much more likely to say comments relating to that category than were women. And finally, a small number of people, these were all either members of minority groups, or women, or both, said less tokenism. Stop treating me as, and I use their own words, a trick pony. These are people who felt that because they were female, because they were from a minority, their organization sort of held them up, pointed to them and said, look, we're inclusive. And they really didn't like that, not surprisingly. So those are the sorts of things that perhaps might make people feel more included. On top of the list is that relationship with a manager. So people's relationship with a manager may be a key component then in how included people feel they are. Feeling included by your manager is important. So it's important that managers are inclusive, do have more inclusive behaviors. But how inclusive actually are managers? Well, one of the things we could do is to ask managers, and that's what we did. We asked any participants in our research who were themselves managers or leaders to answer 11 questions about their inclusive leadership style. Here's one of those questions, for example: I regularly seek out the perspectives of others, including those I lead. So I'm going to actually launch that as a poll for you now. And any of you who are yourself managers, you might want to just take a moment to fill in that poll yourself. If you're a manager or leader or supervisor or team leader, just take a moment to fill in that poll. And we'll just give you a little while longer. I'll take an opportunity to have a glass of water. Okay. Just about 60% of you have voted, and I'm aware that not all of you may be managers. Let's see if we get to 2/3. Okay. That's 66%, so I'll close at 67%. As soon as I say it's closing, people answer, which is fair enough. Let me close the poll now and share the results. So we can see that 42% of you strongly agree, 51% agree. So I think that is 93% of you agree or strongly agree that you regularly seek out perspectives of others, including those you lead. Okay, let's just take that poll away and let's see how people in our survey answered that and the other 11 questions. So you can see from those results that managers in our study overall saw themselves as very inclusive. At the top of the chart there, 99% agreed or strongly agreed that they showed respect for differences and adapted as required. Again, 99% can see how their background and experiences are different from others. The question I ask you, I regularly seek out perspectives of others, including those I lead, is halfway down this list. 95% of the managers in our study agreed or strongly agreed with that, which is actually spookily similar, I guess, to the 93% of you who agreed or strongly agreed with that. And as you can see, the numbers stay in the 90s or 80s, almost to the bottom of that list. And even the least endorsed question, I openly share my awareness of my personal blind spots and biases, was agreed or strongly agreed to by 68%. And if I'm honest with myself, I'm not sure that I could really honestly say I agree, certainly not strongly agree with that statement. So it looks on that basis as if our managers, our leaders in our survey were very inclusive. And it may be that is the case. It may be that leaders are inclusive, or that we just happened to have some very inclusive leaders take part in our survey. But maybe, just maybe, something else was happening. And we're able to check this because 8 of those 11 leadership questions match the questions that we'd asked all survey respondents about their manager. So, for example, in the top line of that chart there, we asked people, how much do you agree with my manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including mine? And we asked leaders, how much do you agree with I regularly seek out the perspectives of others, including those I lead? This is how leaders saw themselves, as we've already seen, very positively. And this is how they rated their own manager on the corresponding question. Largely positively, but certainly not as positively as they rated themselves. On every single question, on average, leaders rated themselves as more inclusive than their manager. On average, across all the questions, they rated themselves 23% higher than they rated their manager. So it may be that we just happened to hit on a really inclusive set of managers, and their managers were nowhere near inclusive, or it may be that they were actually perhaps taking a slightly rose-tinted view of themselves and had a more realistic view of how inclusive their manager was. And if we look at people in the survey who were not themselves leaders, they were even less positive about their managers. The average difference between these ratings and their leaders' self-rating is 33%. Now, of course, it's possible, if we look at the results, that some managers might have deliberately set out to make themselves look good, to cheat in a way, to make themselves deliberately look better than they knew they really were. But this was an entirely anonymous, confidential survey. Wasn't something that was being used in recruitment or selection. There's no reason why people should make themselves look better than they were. It's probably more likely that some, maybe many leaders, have an unrealistically positive view of their own inclusive leadership behaviors and attitudes. They perhaps genuinely think they're inclusive when perhaps they aren't, or at least not as inclusive as perhaps they think they are. There's a gap, a leadership perception gap, and that might be worrying, because if leaders are important for fostering inclusion, if they feel they're behaving more inclusively than they actually are, where's the impetus for them to actually increase their level of inclusive behaviors, of inclusive leadership? One of the ways you try to combat this is by developing a virtual workshop to build inclusive leadership. And this looks to teach leaders the behaviors and skills they need to drive that culture of inclusion and enhance performance. And really it's concentrating on diversity of thought, how people differ in their perceptions, their experiences, their backgrounds, their work styles, their values, and of course their personality types. It's a 3-part workshop where it starts with participants finding out more about themselves using the Mbti framework, and also includes a self-evaluation of their inclusive leadership style. And unlike the participants in the research that you've seen, actually feeds that back to them, challenges this, and builds on this to help them increase their level of inclusive leadership. And in fact, the inclusive leadership questions we use in our research are a subset of what we use on the program. So let's try and sum up. In terms of research, we've just really looked at some of the highlights of research today, but we're going to give you a link after this webinar where you can download the whole research report. But let's think about what we can learn from what we talked about today. We can see that results show there are factors to how included at work a person feels themselves to be, and that most people feel mostly positive about all four of those. But some people don't feel so included. And there are practical actions, I think, that organizations can take to increase those levels of perceived inclusion in the workforce. So, for example, they can make it clear that they are at least maintaining the amount of attention being paid to the issues of diversity and inclusion. Increasing the amount of attention will bring some benefits, but that needs to be sustainable year on year. They can ensure there's an inclusion initiative or program in place. As you see, our results suggest that only having a diversity initiative, while that's useful, isn't as effective, isn't as powerful as having a dedicated inclusion program. And also make sure that those include programs contain a training element. Otherwise, they might be just seen as box ticking, be less effective, even perhaps counterproductive. Now, as we've seen, some people do feel less included. So organizations might review what they're doing to make employees feel valued, and whether the culture really does allow individuals to speak out. What, for example, is the example of senior management on this? And that widening of the culture shouldn't just apply to new hires, but to all employees already in post, including middle and junior managers. And in particular, it seems that some people may feel they can't state their sexual orientation, and that these individuals then feel significantly less included. So some organizations might find it useful to check if the culture of their business allows people to be gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans without consequence to them. On the article that I've just referencing here, and we're going to send you a copy of these slides later so that you can actually write this down if you want. By all means, take a screenshot as well. By Mara, Gineas, and Bruni Eichart, talks through a range of strategies that your organization might find useful for this. We've seen that personality affected how included by their managers people have felt themselves to be, and how inclusive managers and leaders believe themselves to be. Individuals with introverted thinking in particular felt more included than others, and leaders scoring higher on inclusive leadership were more likely to have an intuition personality preference. And I think that both of those results really emphasize the importance of the personality dynamics of that manager-employee relationship in fostering inclusion. And I think in practical terms, this means that although inclusive leadership, that managers should be able to be aware of the importance of personality and image differences in the way they relate to and their contact with their reports, and very much avoid a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to fostering inclusion, and that they should be aware of their own personality preferences and of how they can best work with others with different preferences. And I think that's very important, just for inclusion, but for many aspects of leadership. And as we've seen, asking leaders to self-report their levels of inclusive leadership can't really stand on its own, but should form part of some sort of integrated program, including other elements such as development of greater self-awareness, facilitated self-assessment of their own inclusive leadership, and other feedback, which of course is why we've put together the Inclusive Leadership Program. So we've been going for, I think, 49 minutes. That's just about it in terms of the content of what I'm going to talk about today. But let me just turn over back now to Jen, and she has, I think, a few more things to say before we go for a few questions. And I can see there's quite a few questions in the question box already.
Thanks, John. As John said, if you're interested in increasing inclusion in your workplace, check out our Inclusive Leadership Harnessing Diversity of Thought virtual workshop. We'll send you more information on this workshop along with the webinar recording and slides in the next couple days. So let's move on and answer some of your questions. The first question, John, is, do you think hybrid working is having an impact on inclusion?
I'd be very surprised if it didn't. I'm not going to give a definitive answer just at this stage, because actually we're just finishing crunching the numbers on another research survey, which looks specifically at the differences between people who work in a hybrid way, people who work entirely remotely, and people who are more, well, entirely office-based. And although we haven't included all the inclusion questions in there, we've included a couple of the questions, so we'll get back to you on that, and hopefully that research should be a subject of a future webinar as well. So sorry to do a politician and duck the answer, but I want to make sure I give you a correct answer, and we haven't quite finished crunching the numbers on that yet. But good question, thank you.
Next question, how do you start this conversation without offending leaders by pointing out they have bias?
Really good question. Quite a tricky question as well. Thank you, whoever asked that question. And I think that one of the things that this research shows is that, you know, we all do have biases, and we may see ourselves, it's entirely natural and human to do so, as being more skilled, being better, being more inclusive than we really are. You can see an example of this, pardon me, if you ask people, are you above average at driving? And there's a survey done in the States some years ago which said that, and I think the answer was 92% of people said they're above average driver, which clearly is a statistical nonsense, but shows that we tend to see ourselves generally in a positive light. So I think what research like this shows is that we're all human, we all tend to see ourselves positively, but research like this helps to act as an antidote to that. Helps to say, well, perhaps, you know, there are some areas where you may want to think a little bit more about some of the behaviours. And there's something I think for me, I'm introducing these research findings about people in general, or managers in general, not about you as a manager, which helps to diffuse that situation. But good question.
Okay, next question. On the slide where you talked about sexuality, you didn't show trans. Why is that?
Well, we did put up a number of categories for people to answer, and trans was one of those available categories. It's not on the slide simply because too few people answered it. 251 people took part in our survey. I think less than 1% identified as trans, and there just wasn't enough data to actually analyze that statistically. All the findings you've seen here, all the things I quoted are statistically significant using appropriate statistics, whether it's chi-square or significance testing between groups. So that's the only reason. But yeah, if we had a larger sample, that would be good. You may also notice we didn't have any data there on people with disabilities, which is also clearly an aspect of inclusion. And we just, again, knew we'd felt we wouldn't have a large enough sample, which turned out to be the case, to really ask those questions of enough people in a sensitive enough way. But it would be interesting to do that, perhaps partly with a disability organisation in some future research. Thank you.
So we have a question from Mary. What is the impact on inclusion in employee retention?
Interesting question. We didn't specifically ask the question, are you planning to leave your job, in this survey. Other research suggests that previous research suggests that the more included you are, the less likely you are to leave, perhaps not surprisingly. And again, that's something that we're going to touch on in the other research that we just crunching numbers on, what I mentioned, because we did actually ask that question. So, for example, we found that people who are working entirely in the office were more likely to say they're going to leave their job than hybrid or remote workers. And we will be looking at that with an inclusion lens in that research as well. But yeah, other research, we haven't included that question in this research, but other research quite clearly shows that.
Francis asks, how can we build a culture that allows staff to speak out? We are struggling with this.
I think it's difficult. I think it has to come from the top. I think you've seen in the slides some of the actions that help to make people feel more included. I do really recommend that article that I mentioned. Let's go back a few slides. And that does have a lot of practical suggestions in it. That's Samara, Ganesh, and Brune Eichardt. Although it's the title Strategies for Coping with LGBT Discrimination at Work, it also talks about some strategies for helping people to speak out as part of that, and I think that that's very, very useful. But no, I think it's a difficult action. I think, as always, it has to start from the top. It has to start from the top. For example, we saw a real sea change in people able to speak about mental illness in the UK, when some more senior people in organisations felt they could speak up about it. So I think that's a really good place to start. And if senior people in your organisation aren't prepared to do that, then I may actually question how committed the organisation is to helping people to speak out. Good question. Actually, they're all good questions. I'll stop saying good question.
Bonnie asks, is there any relationship between size of the organization and levels of perceived inclusion?
Yes, there is. And I didn't include it in this presentation. It's one of the things that's in the full research report. But what we found was that, and it's an interesting finding, people in very, very small organizations, 10 people or less, felt the most included. And then people in the next sort of size chunk up, and I think we said 11 to 20, felt not at all included. And then inclusion slowly climbed till we got to mid-sized organizations, and then dropped down again till we got to very large organizations. So people in very, very small organizations feel the most included, followed by people in mid-sized organizations, people in smallish organizations or in very large organizations felt the least included. Interesting finding. I can see why the very small organizations might work. I'm not quite sure the reason for that. There you go. With my statistician's head on, I can't actually give you a definitive answer. But that was the results. And again, you'll see this and other findings in the full research report.
Awesome. We have time for one more question. Last question will be from Nancy. Have you applied these in international organizations with employees of diverse countries to compare responses and identify the cultures of each country?
The short answer is no. You may have noticed from the one of the initial slides that this research was carried out on a mixed group of people. 53%, I think, or was it 56%, were from the United States, 29% from the UK, 50% from other countries around the world. And this was a research piece. What we haven't done is carry out this inclusion survey within lots of individual organizations. I think that would be really interesting. I think if any of you want to apply some of these questions within your organizations, do get in touch, and we can give you access, perhaps to some of those items, provided we can see some of the results that come out, because I think that would be really interesting. But we haven't applied these within organizations. We have begun to run those inclusive leadership workshops within organizations. In fact, that's what it's designed for. And those, I think, have proved very effective in increasing the level of inclusive leadership within those organizations, and have acted as an eye-opener. Even I have to say to some of the members of our own company's leadership team, which is gratifying, I think. But thank you for that.
All right, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for today. If we didn't get the chance to answer your question, we'll be sure to get back to you later this week. Thank you again for joining us in today's webinar, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.